Alrighty, so I'll go ahead and get my screen share set up now that I've given my little overview spiel. Alrighty, so great to be here with you all. As I said, I am Lucy Cambria, even though it says my name here is Dave Johnson. I think that's the NCSS folks there. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm a curricular solution architect at Newsela. Fancy way of saying that I get to support district partnerships in Michigan and some other states across the Midwest with aligning Newsela's curricular resources to your district's particular goals, priorities, and challenges. I've been in education my entire career. It's the only thing I ever wanted to do, besides being a pediatrician. And then I found out I wasn't good enough at biology for that. But this is my first role outside of a school-based setting. I've lived and worked in Washington, D.C. since college, and that's where I was a vice principal and an instructional coach right before joining Newsela. So that's a little bit about me. You'll hear some other likely kooky anecdotes about me as we push forward on about my students. Like to share lots of stories. Would love to hear from you, who's joining us from the chat. We do have a survey after where you can share your information and we can answer deeper questions, but feel free to pop in the chat with your name, where you're joining from, and we'll get going. So our session today is obviously about social studies. This is an amazing conference, an amazing topic to get to really dive deep. And we're going to look at social studies from a couple of different lenses. And first and foremost, we're going to think about how Newsela can help you contextualize historical events, enhancing student understanding and helping students develop those transferable skills, which we know are so important for college career and beyond. Then we'll think about how inquiry design and alignment to the C3 framework in Newsela allows for greater student engagement and then therefore greater achievement. And then we'll discover how Newsela can support your social studies curriculum with standards aligned content and instructional cross-curricular resources. So it sounds like a lot today, which it is. I believe we have till 6:30, so I will jump in without any further ado. I think it's important for us to ground ourselves in what's going on currently in classrooms, not just because Newsela was first formed as a current events platform, but because what's happening right now in your classrooms, in your communities, in your schools, in your districts is top of mind for you. And it's top of mind for us because we're here to support you all. So I wanted to share this quote. This is from Michigan State Superintendent of Education, Dr. Michael Rice, came out just a few days ago. And this was very striking for me. And I'm sure a lot of people either identify with or have thoughts about this quote. So I think this is important for the current moment. It's important for us to teach the full breadth of US and world history about major historical themes, movements, and groups. We have a responsibility to teach history comprehensively. Some of our history's chapters are challenging, uncomfortable, or even searing, particularly those that deal with race, racism, xenophobia, and sexism. But our young people need to learn about all of history and to wrestle with the complexity. So this task, like this Herculean task of teach history comprehensively, help young people wrestle with that complexity, that's all on your shoulders as social studies educators, as those that support social studies teachers and classrooms. So we really recognize that this is in some ways the weight of the world. And so we're here to support alongside you. And then I also want to think about why social studies, though. Like, why such an emphasis on this particular discipline, right? And of course, all of us know and love social studies, right? But actually, the research shows some really exciting stuff to back that up. So this is some research from the Fordham Institute, and it says increased instructional time in social studies, but not in ELA, is associated with improved reading ability. Social studies, is the only subject with a clear, positive, and statistically significant effect on reading improvement. Boom, mic drop, end of discussion. No, I'm just kidding. We're going to keep going. On average, students who receive an additional 30 minutes of social studies instruction per day, roughly equivalent to moving from the 10th to the 90th percentile of social studies instructional time in grades 1 through 5, outperform students with less social studies. We will certainly be sharing all of the sources here, and thanks, Scott, for jumping in on Dr. Rice's quote there too. I appreciate it. And so what do we always hear as teachers of social studies? That you have to also be a teacher, a reading teacher. Like we're always like, it's almost always ingrained into us of like, everybody's a teacher of literacy, but they don't also say that everybody should also be a teacher of social studies. And the data is actually elevating that that's what should happen. And yes, everybody should teach literacy, but not at the sacrifice or to the detriment of social studies instruction. So our work today is really how we can marry strong social studies instructional practices, still keeping a keen eye to those foundational literacy skills that students need to be successful in an inquiry-based model, what they need to be able to contend with and wrestle with those complex topics, in the words of Dr. Rice, and to take those skills out of the classroom and into their world. And not to mention, have a little bit of fun doing it too. So this is sort of our current moment where we're starting today. Let's jump into practice. We have a little framework here for interdisciplinary social studies instruction, just some practices, some high leverage practices that can bring this work into focus for our students. So let's take that urgency and that maybe take a little bit of weight off your shoulders by thinking about how we bring this into action. First, we're going to talk about how we can connect instructional materials to students' lives. So important, and yet can be difficult. Then, of course, we're going to contextualize historical events and talk about how New Fellows resources can help us do that in the classroom. Then my personal favorite as both an instructional coach and a vice principal, this was 95% of my job of empowering teachers to be able to help students. And now more than ever, it's important to me in this role to do the same. And then last but not least, really weave in those literacy skills with rich and varied content to achieve what that earlier slide, that earlier graph showed us about improvements in reading comprehension. So in just a second, the Poll Everywhere link is up here. I'm going to launch a few questions for you all. It's going to be the same link every time. I asked one of my colleagues maybe to drop it in the chat in case you don't want to scan, but you can certainly scan or just enter the Poll Everywhere in your browser. I'll give you maybe a minute to do that. And when you are done, maybe you'll give me a thumbs up, a little Zoom reaction. Letting me know that you were able to access that poll. Thanks, Jared. You can copy paste that from the Zoom chat. Were you able to get it? Thanks, Mary. Thanks, Heather. Like folks were able. Thanks, Ben. All right. If folks trickle in, we'll drop that link one more time, but I'll move forward in the interest of time. So I think it's important as we kick off this section of connecting instructional material to students' lives, it's great to think about ourselves personally and how we learn and how we have learned. I'm going to ask this question here. Something you learned about recently, in brief, couple of words or a phrase that you were personally invested in, that you had a personal connection to. I can think of several off the top of my head, but I want to hear from you first. If the poll isn't working for you, feel free to use the chat as well. There's always like my mini panic moment of like, is anybody actually going to answer? Art at the Broad Museum. Now I want to know what art. I love it. Okay. So you have to come off mute. Now that you said something called mudlarking, I need to know what that is.
My friend Julie is teaching in London this year, and the Thames River is a tidal river. And so the river, when tide is low, the mud banks are exposed. And people for hundreds of years, when the tide goes out, they go down on the mud banks and they pick out things that have fallen in the river. And then you learn the history behind the objects that are pulled out. That's mudlarking.
Wow. Okay. Now I've learned something, and now I need to do more research to figure out what kind of things they pull out of the mud, because that's really cool.
It's
okay,
amazing.
And these are like, I love it. Thank you, Mary, for sharing. And okay, true crime, absolutely. I've heard there are some new ones on the ever-present streaming platforms. Something about the worst roommate ever. I've heard that's a good one. Environmental policies and climate change. Yeah, and unfortunately, I think not enough people are personally invested in that one, and that could be a challenge for us in the years ahead. Thank you for sharing. Example I give all the time was I am an avid podcast listener and was recently learning about Puerto Rico and the history of Puerto Rico as a territory. And it became really important to me recently because my husband's family is from there. His cousins live there. We got married there. And so it's important to me to learn about the history of a place that I'm now connected to. I wasn't connected to before. So these things change, evolve, and grow. And to Mary's earlier point of this is not something she knew anything about, but now she's interested in it. And it had to do with a friend of hers and travel. And so I love those pieces there. I'm going to push us forward. Thank you all for sharing. How do we create these impactful connections for our students? I think of all of the ways in which our full lives, right, all the people we know, all the places we get to travel, in certain aspects, our students' lives can be a bit smaller than ours. And what we really want is that the content of our classroom becomes carpool and dinner table discussion, right? And so when we think about value of work, we think about how students should be given multiple opportunities to understand not just the value, but also the relevance of what they're learning, the why, and that the value and relevance that comes from that learning outweighs the cost of the effort that they're putting in. It's our job as educators to create entry points for our students into the learning. And in order to do this, we need to know what's of value to our students. We need to know them. And some research here has shown us that a lot of what students care about can be some pretty spicy topics in our mind. Maybe these are things that we did not talk about in our own history classrooms as students. Maybe we're not super comfortable addressing these things. So the research shows that many folks, because of that, maybe half, a little more than half, are or a little less than half, I'm sorry, are sort of avoiding those topics as a way to step away from that discomfort. So I think that this is interesting as we think about building connections. I have another question for you all. It's not on a poll. I just want you to use the chat. What is the connection? I'm just transitioning pretty quickly here in the interest of time. What do you think the connection is between these two pieces of text? The first one is a nationwide rise in cyberbullying spurs schools to take action. And the second is a primary source on American leaders questioning the loyalty of Japanese Americans. Pop in the chat, history buffs. What do you think the connection is here? A couple of words, a sentence, give you a few minutes. I'll drink some water while I'm waiting. I got crickets. If I was quick enough, I would put the cricket emoji in the chat. There we go. I got it. Okay, so questioning loyalty could also be a form of bullying. Thanks, Heather. That's interesting. Stereotyping, ganging up on others. Anybody else? Any other thoughts? Okay. Yep. A rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans that's connected to Japanese internment camps, ganging up on a particular person or group. Okay. All right. So I'm going to jump over to the platform in just a minute. But I just wanted to orient us a little bit around, and we'll dive a little bit deeper into this. New Zealand's social studies is most of what we'll be diving into today, and that's our subscription level access. So many of you folks may be familiar with New Zealand, maybe your district purchases it, or maybe you're just using the free version, the current events. But we'll be exploring some of the curations and collections in New Zealand social studies. Particularly, we're about to dive into the C3 Inquiries and DBQs collection, which was actually authored in partnership with the C3 framework authors, widely respected and recognized in the world of social studies, of course. So this is really exciting. It's not New Zealand's take on C3. It's really the intention of the inquiry focus. So that's really cool. But I'm going to jump over to show you what the connection actually is, because this was surprising to me too. This is actually an exploration. Before diving into that primary source, we have students explore limits to personal freedom. So this is actually how the inquiry starts, by giving students examples of how freedoms can be limited in schools and some of the controversy around that. And this particular article that you just saw was about how schools are limiting cell phone use or able to enforce disciplinary action on students that are cyberbullying even outside of the school building. So it's about limits to personal freedom. And the question is here, should freedom be sacrificed in the name of national security? So as I jump into the platform, you can see that the inquiry begins first with current material. And we start not with the history or the primary source, but with relevant and current text that students can really relate to. And we build interest around this compelling question and then we dive deeper into some of those primary sources. So here we have the reasons for and against internment, where students are exposed to multiple primary sources, as well as different kinds of stimuli here, as you can see a photograph. All the while, on the right-hand side, and we'll dive deeper into this as well, we have teacher-facing support, alignment to that C3 framework, explanation of these supporting questions, so that teachers feel supported as they move into this inquiry. As classrooms get deeper into the inquiry, the primary sources like this one are introduced to further that conceptual understanding and humanize these complex topics, challenging the dominant narratives of history that may have been the way it's always been done. And then finally, after jumping all through this inquiry here and even connecting back, way back in time, we end with the taking informed action piece, where students get to reflect on these issues today. And I think that came up in the chat, right? About how there are echoes of this in today's world, really unfortunate echoes. Any questions? Feel free to jump into the chat if you have any questions about the C3 inquiries. Another plug here is that you are going to have access to a New Zealand Social Studies demo account at the end of this session. So you'll be able to explore not just this inquiry, but the many US history and other world history inquiries that we have built into the platform. All right. I'll move to contextualizing historical events, this next section here. This is a great one because this is how we bring those connections to life. The connections that we just built, that relevancy, now we need to build in the history part, that history that really matters. It explains how we got here, allows us to unpack current issues. So important that we bring life to the history that's been traditionally left out of the classroom conversation. So we can be honest about the past and the current situation that we're in, reflecting back on Dr. Rice's quote there. So what do we mean by contextualizing historical events? So you heard about one of our partners, C3. Another one of our amazing partners is Learning for Justice. So you'll see a lot of references to that partnership across the platform, and I'm taking a definition for them. Contextualizing history means telling everybody's story, always providing context as to what privileges allowed certain people to succeed, what forces held other people down. To me, it really means not just describing the what of what happened, but also the lead up to those events, the different perspectives that influenced the event, and the impact and the echoes of the event in today's world. So I'm going to jump over to the platform in just a second. Again, in New Zealand Social Studies, we have a lot of really comprehensive offerings, particularly in the US history realm. I'm going to explore two of them in just a minute here with you all. And what I mean by comprehensive is that there's enough material to support a year-long course of study in US history, and I'm going to show Black US history as well. And I think this is a really important piece here, and I've jumped into one of the units, one of our new units. We just released 4 or 5 new units on this one. Course and Consequences of World War II, 1939 to 1945. US history, I think, has often been taught with a single story. And in my own family history, I think knowing the experience of my grandfather in the Pacific theater of World War II as a navigator has really been my major exposure to World War II history. Of course, learning about it in high school, in AP US history, and then of course the popular movies that we've all seen and consumed. To that end, I think this rediscovering US history course is not just learning for our students, but can also be learning for us as educators. It includes content to unpack and highlight unheard perspectives. And I think it's so important because as society changes and evolves, educators really need the resources to meet the moment and dynamically implement contextualized history in their classrooms. So I just want to show here, this unit has several topics inclusive of a review and an extension. This is great because it allows teachers to sort of go over those core pieces, especially important in times of academic disruption, and then also allows for students to get really creative and for us to get really creative on how we're going to assess students, and jumping in with lots and lots of connections. Again, not just a single story here, and really not just a story of oppression or of something terrible that happened, but also the echoes of it in today's world and some of what has been, what has happened since then. So this is just, again, a peek at the scope and sequence of that US history course. It goes all the way up to the 1980s, but there is so much here to dive into. Jumping over to Black US history, another incredible comprehensive offering with over 180 days of instruction, can be used as a full Black US history course or incorporated modularly into a traditional US course. We really cover a wide breadth of topics and themes. And for example, in every single one of the units in Black US history, we have these making connections lessons. We sort of look at the past and then fast forward to the future to think about, again, those echoes and those stories of here, art, politics, economic triumph, and trial, right? So looking at both the good and the bad. I think that's really the beauty of Newsella as a social studies resource, that we can be responsive to the news, like articles when Beyonce is dropping a surprise single on Juneteenth. But then we also pair that with those amazing primary sources and those key historical artifacts that help students better understand the significance of those events that we're unpacking. And again, we're not just dropping the text here, we're also supporting teachers and classroom practitioners with really how they can go about bringing these articles into life in the classroom. All right. Oh, wow, we already got answers in this one. How did that happen? All right, so I guess that one was out of order. Sorry about that. But we'll keep it moving. We'll try to keep it moving. Come on, slide. More. All right. There we go. Okay. So I've talked a lot about empowering teachers through some of the resources that we have curated, but I think it's also important to talk about how we take that a step further. This work cannot start or begin or finish or come to life without our teachers. Newsella has always had a very close relationship with our teachers, and we really want to continue that in the future. And we want to make sure that you have everything you need to be ready to do this work and make that content come alive. And if we don't hold you all at the center of the conversation and allow you to build your practice and capacity, we really run the risk of social studies not getting the attention it deserves. And then the impact of that is really our students not getting the learning they deserve and not being prepared for college, career, and beyond. So this is super important to me. So Newsella supports with larger initiatives and professional learning plans in a variety of different ways. Really, it's important to us that we provide lots of different options. As you're making these shifts, whether you're new to inquiry or you're diving back in, or you have a whole host of new teachers coming on board, as is the case in many districts, we can really support you in two different ways. And I'm going to show some examples of both of those. So this is our professional learning page. You can think of this as really self-guided snippets of information, bite-sized PD, where teachers can navigate through before or while they're planning, and they can pick these 5-minute teacher reads. They can think about how they're going to set up their classes. Those are like the tactical pieces. And then they can even jump in further with focusing in on social studies practices and really diving into the C3 framework here. The next way, of course, that we deliver professional learning is through synchronous or asynchronous live sessions. So I think that was a little redundant, but we provide them either recorded or live for you, and we do some PD in person as well. And this is also just great to think about how you're going to bolster the initiatives, not just in your classroom, but with the whole school community. I pulled out some of those live or asynchronous options here, which I think really match with what we're talking about today. And these are deep dives where you get to have a lot of practice, where you get to put your teacher hat on and climb through the resources. Our professional learning managers are just incredible, and they really bring this content to life. And this is honestly what's necessary in order to make the most out of, as I said, Newsella subscription. So, well, I've given you a lot of content here. I'm gonna pause, step back, like, whoa, that's Newsella? This is crazy, right? I think most of the time when I give one of these presentations, people are like, oh, I didn't know you had all that. Oh, wow, okay, it's more than I thought. And I think it's important to sort of reintroduce who we are after I gave you all those exciting opportunities. It's important for you to know that as an instructional content platform, these are the things that are important to us because we know that they're important to you. We, meaning Jared, who's on the call, and myself, have countless meetings with districts where we're hearing all the time, it's super important that whatever we adopt is aligned to the standards. It's super important that our teachers have a vetted and authentic place to go where they're able to access this content. It's super important that we're reaching students at all levels, that the content is accessible, that it's updated, and that it's relevant in this world. And then, of course, that you as the educators are able to see how students are performing and able to address those instructional needs. So this is really who Newsella is at its core, and this is what we offer as an instructional content platform. And so about 2 years ago, we actually segmented into these 4 subject-specific solutions. You may be familiar with Newsella Pro or Newsella Essentials or the free version, as I said, but these are really our 4 core subject solutions. And what you're getting out of those is really some of what I've already showed you, that content curation, those really magical partnerships with C3 and Learning for Justice, and then that instructionalization where we're supporting you in the implementation of that content with your students. Last but not least, thinking back to that other slide, we have alignment to the state standards in these subject-specific solutions. So if you're a Michigan teacher, you're going to see Michigan social studies standards. You'll be able to search for them. You'll be able to save those standards in the platform. So it's really helps you to drive further towards your goals there. And how do we do that? Well, many of you know this, we take content from over 175 sources and we make it instruction ready. We focus on really high interest content, which comes mostly from sources that were not purpose-built for education, but news sources like the Washington Post and the New York Times, magazines like National Geographic and Scientific American, references like Encyclopedia and Encyclopedia Britannica. But we also use content from sources educators know and love, like curriculum and assessments authors. We have great partnerships with iCivics and the Big History Project. And so a lot of what you're already doing, already bringing into the classroom, we probably have a partnership with them. So this last piece of our framework, and I know I'm jumping around a little bit, but I think this really drives in why Newsella's adoption as a cross-curricular resource is favorable. because I'm going to jump over to a little bit of ELA in just a second. I think an interdisciplinary approach involves ensuring that students' comprehension and literacy development also plays a part in our social studies instruction. We have the ability within the platform to address many of the challenges and barriers that students and teachers face in content area literacy, because we provide that automatic and adaptive differentiation, because we have those flexible formative assessment features, and because we have that visibility into student activity to inform instructional choices. And I'm thinking back to this slide here, to this graph, where the more instructional time that gets devoted to social studies, the greater reading growth students can have. That's because when we connect the students' lives, what they care about, those quote unquote, like I like to say, spicy topics, we can actually grab them in and they forget that they're reading and annotating. I have another poll everywhere question for you there. Jump back in. And if you choose other here, please put it in the chat. Again, that scary moment of like, is anybody gonna do my poll? Yes, you did it, thank you. Such a huge one in social studies, text structures and features. And then, yeah, these would definitely be the top two. And that summarizing and synthesizing piece, I think, as far as coming from my own literacy background, that can be a really opaque brain process. Meaning, like, especially at the secondary level, we don't know a ton about what reading comprehension looks like in the brain. So it can be difficult to parse out, like, was it the vocabulary? Was it the background knowledge? Was it this other piece? Were they just having a bad day? So that can be really sticky. And I think it's clear that many dimensions of C3, I'm just clicking over to this, have a lot to do with reading comprehension, right? Developing questions, communicating and critiquing conclusions, gathering and evaluating sources, developing claims and using evidence. Those are comprehension-based skills. They are, right? They involve the need for students to be able to really understand what they're reading and the stimuli that they're coming across. So supporting literacy skill practice can often lead to overuse of repetitive skill practice, what folks in the industry may call drill and kill, or skill and drill, or sit and get, lots of different negative names for that. And this really runs the risk of disengaging and demoralizing our students. So it's important that we weave literacy skill practice into those engaging lessons with authentic and relevant content at the center. So how do we do that in Newsela, and how can Newsela support that work? As I mentioned, I'm jumping over to the ELA platform actually. So in the browse menu, ELA, and I think your demo account is going to have ELA access to a curation called debate and discussion. So debate and discussion is actually broken down into 3 sections here. Elementary, middle, and high school debates, knowing that those topics differ for different grade levels. And I picked this one on Too Young to Vote. There's quite obviously a real connection here between the civic standards for Michigan and being too young to vote, or having a conversation about that, right? So we're allowing for students to make their own judgment You can see some opinion pieces in here where we can encourage students to maybe use this as a mentor text and have really great conversation about this. On the right-hand side, again, those lesson sparks, all of these blue links are graphic organizers. There's even a rubric included. There's a reflection sheet. There's an organizer to really support student learning and for you to, again, have that accountability measure where you're able to give students feedback, where you're able to really make things sticky. And then as well, there are full built out before, during, and after reading sequences here so that you can maybe take some of this or take it or take all of it or create your own debate and use some of the resources. There's a lot of different options here. And there's a lot of ways in which you could make your own curation, your own text set on a certain debate topic that you wanted to bring into the classroom. We have a pro-con curation. We have our paired text collection, lots of opportunities there to develop those great literacy skills alongside relevant, authentic topics. The other piece about literacy skill development, I haven't really spoken a lot about those 4 question quizzes that are loaded into Newsela. Something most people know about Newsela, and they're like, oh yeah, great, 4 question quizzes. It's helpful for me to know where my students are. But it's sort of a given, right? But we're really excited because we are happy to report that Newsela's embedded formative assessments have been validated through our partnership and our research with NWEA. Most folks in Michigan are NWEA users. I think it's about 80% of the districts across the state. But regardless of that, we know that it's a validated test. And so our quizzes are highly correlated with performance on map growth. So if students are performing well, if students are averaging 80% or higher on Newsela quizzes over the school year, it was predicted that they were going to reach the 80th percentile on average on their spring map growth assessment. This was around 10,000 students from 16 different states, and all students benefited from Newsela equally, regardless of some of the demographic variability, like income and race, which I know is super important to all of us here. And so this is just exciting news to say that Newsela as a driver of literacy skills is a great tool to use in your toolbox. Whew, we talked a lot. I'm sure there are questions. I have 4 minutes left to open the floor for questions. I do have a survey, as I mentioned, for you to complete, and then you will have access to a sandbox demo account, sort of little trial. Jared, if you wouldn't mind dropping the link in the chat to the survey, but you can also scan the QR code. It's a very quick survey. I'll show you. I'm not telling any fibs. It'll just take you a few minutes there, and then you'll get access on that second page to that trial. But if there are questions, I want to encourage you to come off mute or use the chat. And I want to say thank you if you have to run and go make dinner or go watch a true crime documentary. I hope you have a great night. And really, I hope to continue the conversation. And so you have our information there if you have other questions. And that survey is in the chat. Thanks, Jared. And that's all I got for you, unless there are questions.